Sarah Miller stood in her front yard, looking at the white fence that ran along her property line. The fence was exactly 6 feet and 2 inches tall. She had measured it 3 times that morning. The homeowner association rules said fences could only be 6 feet tall. Those 2 extra inches were causing big problems. Sarah and her husband Mike had moved to Oakwood Heights 6 months ago. They thought it would be the perfect place to raise their 2 young children. The neighborhood looked peaceful with its neat lawns and matching mailboxes. The houses were all similar colors with small front gardens. Everything seemed organized and quiet. Mike worked as an engineer at a tech company downtown. He left early every morning and came home late most evenings. Sarah took care of their 4-year-old daughter Emma and 2-year-old son Jake. She had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years before leaving the military to start a family. Most people in the neighborhood did not know about her military background. Sarah preferred to keep that part of her life private. When they first moved in, their neighbors seemed friendly enough. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought them cookies and welcomed them to the community. The Johnson family across the street waved hello when they saw them. Everything felt normal for the first few weeks. The trouble started when they received their first letter from the Oakwood Heights Homeowner Association. The letter was typed on official letterhead and signed by the board president, Robert Hayes. It informed them that their fence was in violation of community standards. The fence needed to be exactly 6 feet tall, not 6 feet and 2 inches. Sarah read the letter twice. She walked outside and measured the fence again. The previous owners had built the fence and it had been there for years. She wondered why no one had complained about it before. 2 inches seemed like such a small thing to worry about. Mike was not too concerned when Sarah showed him the letter that evening. He was tired from work and barely looked at it. "Just cut 2 inches off the top," he said while eating dinner. How hard can that be? But Sarah did not think it was that simple. The fence posts were set in concrete. The wood panels were attached with strong screws. Cutting 2 inches off the entire fence would cost hundreds of dollars and take days of work. It seemed wasteful to destroy a perfectly good fence over such a small difference. Sarah decided to talk to some of her neighbors about the fence situation. She hoped to understand why the homeowner association was being so strict about 2 inches. Mrs. Patterson told her that the HOA board was very serious about rules. "They measure everything," the older woman said while watering her flowers. Last year they made the Rodriguez family repaint their house because the color was too bright. The Johnson family had a different story. Mr. Johnson pulled Sarah aside one afternoon while she was getting mail. He spoke quietly and looked around to make sure no one was listening.
"The HOA board has too much power," he whispered.
"They pick on certain families and make their lives difficult. They forced 3 families to move out last year over small violations." Sarah started paying more attention to how the HOA operated. She noticed that some houses had small violations that were ignored. The Henderson house had a mailbox that was clearly not the standard design. The Williams family had planted flowers that were not on the approved plant list. But these families never seemed to get violation letters. She began to wonder if the board was targeting her family for some reason. Maybe they did not like newcomers. Maybe they thought military families would cause problems. Sarah had seen this kind of behavior before in her military career. Some people like to use small amounts of power to control others. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This one was more aggressive in tone. It demanded immediate compliance with fence height regulations. The letter threatened legal action if the fence was not fixed within 30 days. It also mentioned daily fines that would start if they did not respond quickly. Sarah felt her military training kick in. She had learned to stay calm under pressure and think strategically about problems. Instead of getting angry, she decided to research the HOA rules and her legal rights as a homeowner. She spent hours online reading about homeowner association laws and property rights. What she found was interesting. The HOA had some power to enforce rules, but they also had limits. They could not harass homeowners or single out certain families for unfair treatment. They had to follow proper procedures before taking legal action. Most importantly, they had to prove that violations actually harmed the community. Sarah also discovered that the previous owners of her house had gotten special permission for the fence height. The original building permit from the city allowed for a 6-foot 2-inch fence. The HOA had approved it in writing 5 years ago. She found the paperwork in a folder left by the previous owners. Armed with this information, Sarah decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. The meetings were held monthly in the community center. She had never been to one before, but homeowners were allowed to speak during a public comment period. The community center was a small building with a meeting room that held about 50 people. When Sarah arrived, only 12 people were there besides the 5 board members. Most of the attendees were older residents who seemed to know each other well. Sarah felt like an outsider, but she was determined to speak up for her family. Robert Hayes, the board president, was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and an expensive suit. He ran the meeting like a business conference, following strict rules about who could speak and when. The other board members seemed to defer to his opinions on most topics. When the public comment period arrived, Sarah stood up. She introduced herself politely and explained the situation with her fence. She showed the board the original permit and the written approval from 5 years ago. She asked why they were now saying the fence violated community standards. Robert Hayes barely looked at the paperwork. He dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Previous approvals are not relevant," he said coldly. "Current standards must be followed by all residents. No exceptions will be made." Sarah tried to explain that she had followed all the proper procedures and had official permission for the fence, but Hayes cut her off. "This matter is not open for discussion," he said firmly. "The fence must be corrected or legal action will be taken." As Sarah left the meeting that night, she realized this was not really about fence height. The HOA board was using the fence as a way to establish dominance over her family. They wanted to show that they had power and could force compliance with their demands even when those demands were unreasonable. Sarah had faced bullies before in her military career. She knew that giving in to unreasonable demands only encouraged more unreasonable behavior, but she also knew that fighting back required careful planning and strong resolve. This was just the beginning of what would become a much larger conflict. The third letter from the HOA arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah opened it while Emma played with her toys in the living room, and Jake napped in his crib. This letter was different from the first 2. It was longer and written in legal language that was hard to understand. The letter accused Sarah and Mike of willful noncompliance and flagrant disregard for community standards. It threatened immediate legal action and daily fines of $50 starting the following week. The tone was angry and meant to scare them into quick action. Sarah read the letter 3 times, feeling her anger grow with each reading. She had shown the board proof that their fence was legally approved. She had followed all the proper procedures. Yet they continued to threaten her family as if they had done something wrong. That afternoon, Sarah called Mike at work to tell him about the latest letter. Mike sounded stressed and distracted. "Sarah, I don't have time for this HOA drama," he said. "Just fix the stupid fence so they leave us alone. I have a big project due next week." Sarah felt frustrated by Mike's response. He did not understand that this was not really about the fence anymore. The HOA was trying to bully them, and giving in would only make things worse. But Mike was under pressure at work and did not want to deal with neighborhood conflicts. After hanging up the phone, Sarah decided to do more research about the Oakwood Heights HOA. She spent the next few hours online, reading old meeting minutes and community newsletters. What she found made her very concerned about the situation. Over the past 3 years, the HOA board had forced 12 families to move out of the neighborhood. Each family had been targeted for minor violations that escalated into major legal battles. The board would start with small complaints and then pile on additional violations until families gave up and sold their houses. Sarah found news articles about some of these cases. One family had been sued over the color of their front door. Another had been fined thousands of dollars for planting the wrong type of grass. A military family had been harassed for 6 months over a small shed in their backyard until they finally moved away. The pattern was always the same. The board would pick a target family and find small violations of community rules. When the family tried to fight back or explain their side, the board would escalate the conflict. They used expensive lawyers and endless legal paperwork to wear down families who could not afford to fight back. Sarah realized that her family was just the latest target in this pattern. The 2-inch fence violation was just an excuse to start the harassment process. If they gave in and cut the fence, the board would find other violations to complain about. There would always be something wrong with their house or yard. That evening, Sarah tried to explain the situation to Mike more clearly. She showed him the research she had done and the pattern she had discovered. "This is not about our fence," she said while they sat at the kitchen table after dinner. They are trying to force us out of the neighborhood. Mike looked at the papers Sarah had printed out. He seemed more interested now that he could see the bigger picture. So what do you think we should do? He asked. We cannot afford to hire lawyers and fight these people for months. Sarah had been thinking about their options all day. I want to try talking to some of our neighbors first, she said. If other families are being threatened too, maybe we can work together to stop this harassment. The next day, Sarah started visiting neighbors while the children napped. She went to houses where she had noticed small violations that should have triggered HOA complaints. She wanted to understand why some families were targeted while others were left alone. Mrs. Patterson was working in her garden when Sarah stopped by. The older woman invited her in for coffee and seemed happy to have someone to talk with. I have lived here for 15 years, Mrs. Patterson said. The HOA board used to be reasonable people who just wanted to keep the neighborhood looking nice. What changed? Sarah asked. Robert Hayes became president 3 years ago, Mrs. Patterson explained. He brought in his friends for the other board positions. Now they act like they own the whole neighborhood. They make up new rules whenever they want to target someone. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice and looked around even though they were inside her house. They tried to fine me last year for having the wrong color flowers in my front garden. I had to replant everything with approved plants from their list. Sarah was surprised. Mrs. Patterson seemed like the kind of neighbor the HOA would leave alone. Why did they target you? She asked. I complained at a board meeting about their landscaping contractor, Mrs. Patterson said. The contractor was doing poor work but charging high fees. I thought the community deserved better service for the money we pay. After that, they started finding violations with my property. This conversation gave Sarah important information. The HOA board was not just targeting newcomers or military families. They went after anyone who questioned their decisions or challenged their authority. It was a way to control the entire community through fear and intimidation. Sarah visited 3 more neighbors that week. Each family had a similar story. The Rodriguez family had been fined for their house color after Mr. Rodriguez questioned the HOA budget at a meeting. The Chen family received violation notices after they asked for better playground equipment at the community center. The most disturbing story came from Mrs. Williams, an elderly widow who lived alone at the end of the street. She had been threatened with legal action because her grass was half an inch too long during a week when she was in the hospital. When her son complained about the timing, the board added more violations for her mailbox placement and porch light color. I am scared to leave my house now, Mrs. Williams told Sarah. Every time I go outside, I worry they will find something else wrong with my property. I have lived here for 20 years, but now I'm thinking about moving to a retirement home just to get away from them. Sarah felt angry listening to these stories. The HOA board was terrorizing elderly residents and hardworking families over tiny details that did not matter. They were destroying the sense of community that neighborhoods were supposed to provide. But Sarah also saw an opportunity in these conversations. If multiple families were being harassed, they might be willing to work together to fight back. The board could intimidate one family at a time, but they would have a harder time targeting an organized group of residents. Sarah started keeping detailed notes about each family's situation. She documented the violations they had received and the threats they had faced. She also researched the HOA governing documents to understand what powers the board actually had versus what they claimed to have. What she found was encouraging. The HOA board had to follow specific procedures before taking legal action. They had to give homeowners proper notice and opportunities to respond. They could not just make up rules on the spot or target families for personal reasons. Sarah also discovered that homeowners had rights too. They could call special meetings to vote on board decisions. They could elect new board members if enough residents participated in elections. Most importantly, they could file complaints with state agencies if the board violated fair housing laws. The problem was that most residents did not know about these rights. The board kept people scared and isolated so they would not organize or fight back. Families dealt with their problems alone and often gave up rather than face expensive legal battles. Sarah decided it was time to bring the targeted families together. She planned a small gathering at her house for the following Saturday. She would invite the families who had been harassed and see if they were willing to work together for a solution. The meeting would be risky. If the HOA board found out about it, they might escalate their harassment campaign. But Sarah believed that organized resistance was the only way to stop bullies from continuing their behavior. As she made plans for the meeting, Sarah felt her military training influence her thinking. In the Navy SEALs, she had learned that small, organized teams could overcome much larger and better-equipped opponents through careful planning and coordinated action. The HOA board thought they had all the power because they controlled the official channels and had money for lawyers, but they had made a crucial mistake. They had created so many enemies in the neighborhood that resistance was inevitable. Sarah just needed to help her neighbors realize they were not alone in this fight. Saturday afternoon came with clear skies and warm sunshine. Sarah had spent the morning cleaning her house and preparing snacks for the neighbors she had invited. Emma was at a friend's birthday party and Mike was watching Jake upstairs. Sarah wanted to make sure the meeting would be private and focused. Mrs. Patterson arrived first, carrying a plate of homemade cookies. She looked nervous but determined. "I have been thinking about this all week," she said as Sarah let her in. "Something needs to be done about that board." The Rodriguez family came next, followed by the Chens and Mrs. Williams. By 3 o'clock, 8 adults were sitting in Sarah's living room. They represented 6 different families who had all been targeted by the HOA board for various violations. Sarah started the meeting by thanking everyone for coming. She explained that she wanted to understand the full scope of the HOA's harassment campaign and explore options for fighting back together. "I know this feels scary," she said, "but I think we are stronger as a group than we are alone." Each family shared their story with the group. The details were different, but the pattern was always the same. The board would find minor violations and use them to threaten legal action. When families tried to explain or negotiate, the board would add more violations and increase the pressure. Mr. Rodriguez had the most shocking story. The board had sued his family over their house color, claiming it violated community standards. But when he checked the original HOA documents, there was no specific rule about house colors. The board had made up the rule after they decided they did not like his family's choice. "We spent $8,000 on lawyers," Mr. Rodriguez said. "In the end, we had to repaint the house just to make them stop. But the lawyer told us the board never had legal grounds to sue us in the first place." Mrs. Chen nodded as she listened. "The same thing happened to us with the playground equipment request," she said. "They started finding violations with our yard the day after I spoke at the board meeting. Suddenly our mailbox was too close to the street and our driveway had oil stains." Sarah took notes as each person spoke. She was documenting evidence that showed the board was retaliating against residents who questioned their authority. This kind of behavior might be illegal under state laws that protected homeowner rights. After everyone had shared their experiences, Sarah presented her research about HOA laws and homeowner rights. She explained that boards had to follow specific procedures and could not target families for personal reasons. She also showed them examples of other communities where residents had successfully challenged abusive HOA boards. "The key is documentation," Sarah explained. "We need to prove that the board is not following proper procedures and is targeting families unfairly. If we have enough evidence, we can file complaints with state agencies or even sue the board for harassment." Mrs. Williams raised her hand. "But what if they make things worse for us while we are fighting them?" she asked. "I cannot afford to lose my house over this." Sarah had expected this concern. "That is why we need to be smart about how we approach this," she said. "We document everything, follow all the proper procedures ourselves, and make sure we have legal support before we take action." The group spent the next hour discussing possible strategies. They could organize to elect new board members in the next HOA election. They could attend board meetings in larger numbers to show community opposition. They could also research the board's financial decisions to see if there were problems with how community funds were being spent. Mr. Chen suggested something that surprised everyone. "What if we hired our own lawyer to review all the board's actions?" he said. "If we split the cost between our families, it might be affordable, and having legal representation might make the board think twice about continuing their harassment." This idea excited the group. A lawyer could review their individual cases and advise them about their rights. The lawyer could also send official letters to the board demanding that they follow proper procedures. Sometimes the threat of legal action was enough to make bullies back down. Sarah volunteered to research lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. She would get quotes for reviewing their cases and representing them if necessary. The other families agreed to contribute equally to the legal costs. The meeting was productive, but Sarah could see that some neighbors were still scared. Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside as people were leaving. "What if the board finds out about this meeting?" she whispered. "What if they retaliate against all of us?" Sarah understood the fear, but she also knew that fear was exactly what the board wanted. "They are already retaliating against us," she pointed out. "At least now we are not facing them alone." That evening, Sarah felt hopeful for the first time since the fence dispute began. The meeting had shown her that the community was ready to fight back against the board's abuse. But she also knew that organizing resistance would not be easy. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed something troubling. Her daily routine seemed to be watched more closely than before. When she took the children to the playground, she saw unfamiliar people taking pictures of her house. When she went grocery shopping, someone followed her car for several blocks. At first, Sarah thought she might be imagining things, but her military training had taught her to pay attention to surveillance and unusual behavior. Someone was definitely keeping track of her activities. The confirmation came on Thursday morning. Sarah found a business card stuck in her front door. It was from a private security company called Neighborhood Watch Solutions. The card had a handwritten note that said, "We are monitoring your property for compliance issues." Sarah researched the company online and discovered it was owned by Robert Hayes' brother-in-law. The HOA board was hiring private security to watch families who might cause trouble for them. This was a new level of harassment that went far beyond simple rule enforcement. Sarah called Mrs. Patterson to warn her about the security company. Mrs. Patterson was very upset. "They have no right to watch our houses like criminals," she said. "This has gone too far." But when Sarah suggested they contact the police about the surveillance, Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "What if the police do not believe us?" she asked. "What if the board has connections with local law enforcement?" This concern had not occurred to Sarah, but it was a good point. Small communities often had overlapping relationships between different officials. The HOA board members might be friends with police officers or city council members. Sarah decided to test this theory by filing a complaint with the local police about the surveillance. She called the non-emergency number and explained that a security company was watching her house without her permission. The officer who took her call was polite, but not very interested. "Private security companies can operate on public streets," he explained. "Unless they are trespassing on your property or threatening you directly, there is not much we can do." Sarah asked if the officer could at least verify that the security company was properly licensed and had the right to conduct surveillance. The officer said he would look into it, but Sarah doubted anything would come of the inquiry. That afternoon, Sarah noticed more security activity around the neighborhood. Men in uniform were walking around with clipboards taking pictures of houses and yards. They seemed to be focusing on the families who had attended her Saturday meeting. Sarah realized the board was escalating their campaign. They were trying to intimidate the families who might organize against them. The message was clear. If you challenge the board, you will face increased harassment and surveillance. But Sarah was not intimidated by these tactics. In her military career, she had dealt with much more serious threats than neighborhood security guards. If anything, the board's escalation confirmed that her strategy was working. They were worried about organized resistance, which meant organized resistance could be effective. Sarah called an emergency meeting of the families for that evening. When everyone gathered in her living room again, she could see they were all feeling the pressure from the increased surveillance. "They are trying to scare us into giving up," Sarah told the group. "But this actually shows we are on the right track. If they were not worried about us, they would not be working so hard to intimidate us." Mr. Rodriguez seemed less confident than he had been at the first meeting. "Maybe we should just comply with their demands and hope they leave us alone," he suggested. Sarah shook her head firmly. "That will not work," she said. "I have seen this pattern before. Bullies do not stop when you give them what they want. They just ask for more. The only way to stop them is to fight back effectively." The group spent that evening planning their next moves. They would continue documenting the board's behavior and researching their legal options. They would also start attending board meetings as a group to show that the community was watching the board's decisions. Most importantly, they would not be intimidated by security cameras and surveillance tactics. Sarah's military experience had taught her that psychological warfare only worked if people let it work. If they stayed focused on their goals and supported each other, they could overcome the board's attempts at intimidation. As the neighbors left that evening, Sarah felt the situation entering a new phase. The surveillance continued for a week. Sarah noticed the same security guards walking through the neighborhood every day, taking pictures and writing notes on their clipboards. They seemed particularly interested in her house and the homes of the other families who had attended the meetings. Mike was getting worried about the situation. "This is affecting our children," he said one morning while getting ready for work. "Emma asked me yesterday why strange men were taking pictures of our house. What am I supposed to tell her?" Sarah understood his concerns, but she also knew that backing down now would make things worse. "We tell her that some people are not being fair to our family, but we are working to fix the problem," she said. "Children need to see their parents stand up to bullies." On Tuesday morning, Sarah was in her backyard with both children. Emma was playing on the swing set while Jake crawled around on a blanket in the shade. Sarah was pulling weeds from the flower garden when she heard voices at the front of the house. She looked through the side gate and saw 3 men in security uniforms standing on her front walkway. They were not just taking pictures this time. One of them was trying to peer through the front windows while another was examining the fence that had started all the trouble. Sarah felt her military instincts activate. These men were not just observing from the street anymore. They were on her property without permission, which was trespassing. She needed to handle this situation carefully but firmly. Sarah picked up Jake and called Emma to come with her. She wanted the children inside the house before she confronted the security guards. But as she walked toward the back door, she heard one of the men call out to her. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you," the man said in a loud, commanding voice. He was walking around to the backyard without waiting for permission to enter her property. Sarah stopped and turned around. The man approaching her was tall and heavy, wearing a black uniform with patches that said Security and Neighborhood Watch Solutions. He had a radio clipped to his belt and what looked like a weapon in a holster on his hip. "You are trespassing on my property," Sarah said calmly. "Please leave immediately." The security guard did not seem concerned about her request. "We have authority from the homeowner association to inspect properties for violations," he said. "We need to measure your fence and check for other compliance issues." Sarah knew this was not true. The HOA had no right to send armed guards onto her property without her permission. Security companies could not just claim authority they did not have. But she also realized these men might not understand the legal limits of their job. "Show me the legal document that gives you authority to enter my property," Sarah said. She was still holding Jake, but she positioned herself so she could move quickly if needed. Emma was standing close behind her, looking scared. The security guard seemed annoyed by her challenge. "Lady, we do not need to show you anything," he said. "We are here on official HOA business. You can cooperate or we can call the police." 2 more guards had joined the first one in her backyard. Sarah was now facing 3 armed men who were claiming authority they did not have. The situation was escalating quickly, and she had her children to protect. Sarah's military training had prepared her for situations like this. She assessed the tactical situation while keeping her voice calm and steady. The guards were positioned poorly, standing too close together with no clear escape routes. They seemed to be relying on intimidation rather than professional security protocols. "I am calling the police myself," Sarah said. She pulled out her phone with her free hand while keeping Jake secure in her other arm. "They can sort out what authority you actually have." The lead guard stepped closer to Sarah. "Put the phone down," he said in a threatening tone. "We are trying to do our job here. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Sarah did not put the phone down. Instead, she started dialing 911 while backing toward her house. She wanted to get the children inside and create some distance between herself and the guards. But the lead guard reached out and grabbed her wrist, trying to take the phone away from her. This was assault, and Sarah's military training took over instantly. Sarah shifted Jake to her left arm and used her right hand to break the guard's grip on her wrist. The move was quick and precise, designed to cause pain without permanent injury. The guard stumbled backward, surprised by her defensive skills. "Do not touch me," Sarah said firmly. "You have no authority to put your hands on me or my children." The guard was angry now. He reached for his radio, probably to call for backup or report the incident to his supervisor. The other 2 guards moved closer, trying to surround Sarah and block her path to the house. Sarah realized the situation was about to become more dangerous. 3 armed men were on her property illegally, and they had already demonstrated they were willing to use physical force. She had to get her children to safety and establish control of the situation. "Emma, go inside right now," Sarah said without taking her eyes off the guards. "Lock the door and call Daddy." Emma ran toward the house, and Sarah heard the back door slam a few seconds later. Now she only had to worry about protecting Jake while dealing with 3 aggressive men who did not understand they were way out of their league. The lead guard finished talking on his radio and looked at Sarah with hatred. "You just made a big mistake, lady," he said. "We have backup coming, and you are going to face serious consequences for interfering with our investigation." Sarah almost laughed at the man's ignorance. He had just admitted on the radio that a homeowner had resisted their illegal entry onto her property. Any backup that arrived would find 3 security guards who had violated multiple laws and escalated a simple property dispute into a criminal situation. "Your investigation has no legal basis," Sarah explained patiently. "You are trespassing on private property and threatening a family with children. When the police arrive, you are going to be the ones in trouble." But the guards were not listening to reason. They seemed to think their uniforms and weapons gave them unlimited authority in the neighborhood. The lead guard was reaching for something on his belt, and Sarah realized with alarm that he was going for his weapon. Sarah had hoped to resolve this situation without violence. She had tried to de-escalate and give the guards opportunities to leave peacefully, but they were about to draw weapons on a woman holding a toddler, which crossed every line of reasonable behavior. Sarah's SEAL training had taught her that the best time to act was before an opponent drew their weapon, not after. She had seconds to decide whether to continue trying to de-escalate or take action to protect herself and her son. The guard's hand was now on his weapon. Sarah could see him starting to draw it from the holster. In that moment, she made her decision. Sarah gently but quickly set Jake down behind a large flower pot that would provide him some protection. Then she moved toward the lead guard with speed and precision that shocked all 3 men. Sarah's first move was to grab the guard's wrist and prevent him from fully drawing his weapon. Her grip was stronger than he expected, and he could not complete the draw. At the same time, Sarah used her other hand to strike a pressure point on his neck that would cause pain and disorientation without permanent damage. The guard dropped his weapon and stumbled backward, clutching his neck. The other 2 guards reached for their own weapons, but Sarah was already moving toward them. Sarah had trained for situations where she faced multiple armed opponents in close quarters. The key was speed, precision, and using the opponent's reactions against them. She could disarm all 3 guards before they fully understood what was happening. The second guard got his weapon halfway out of the holster before Sarah reached him. She used a joint lock technique to control his arm, while simultaneously sweeping his legs to take him to the ground. His weapon fell harmlessly onto the grass as he tried to break his fall. The third guard was backing away and fumbling with his weapon when Sarah turned her attention to him. He was the youngest of the 3 and seemed terrified by how quickly his partners had been defeated. "Drop the weapon and leave my property," Sarah said calmly. "This does not have to get worse for any of you." The young guard looked at his fallen partners and then at Sarah. He could see that she was completely in control of the situation despite being outnumbered 3-1. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Sarah quickly collected all 3 weapons and moved back to where Jake was sitting behind the flower pot. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had changed everything about the dispute with the HOA. What had started as harassment over a fence violation had now become a criminal matter involving armed trespassers who had threatened a family. The HOA board had escalated far beyond anything they could justify as routine rule enforcement. Sarah waited for the police to arrive. She knew that this incident would force a resolution to the conflict one way or another. The board could no longer claim they were just trying to enforce community standards. They had hired armed guards who had broken multiple laws on her property. The real consequences of this confrontation were just beginning. The police sirens grew louder as they approached Oakwood Heights. Sarah sat on her back porch steps with Jake in her lap, watching the 3 security guards who were still on the ground or leaning against her fence. She had their weapons collected in a small pile next to her, safely out of their reach. The lead guard was still rubbing his neck where Sarah had applied pressure to disable him. He kept looking at her with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You have no idea who you are messing with," he muttered under his breath. Sarah ignored his threats. She was more focused on making sure Jake stayed calm and that Emma remained safely inside the house. Her daughter had followed instructions perfectly, locking herself inside and calling Mike at work. Sarah could see Emma peeking through the kitchen window, watching everything that was happening. The first police car pulled into Sarah's driveway with its lights flashing. Officer Martinez stepped out and immediately assessed the scene. He saw 3 security guards in various states of distress and one calm woman holding a toddler next to a pile of weapons. "Ma'am, I am Officer Martinez," he said as he approached Sarah. "We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah stood up, still holding Jake, and explained the situation clearly and factually. She told Officer Martinez that the 3 guards had entered her property without permission, refused to leave when asked, and had attempted to draw weapons on her and her children. The lead security guard interrupted Sarah's explanation. "Officer, this woman attacked us while we were conducting an authorized investigation," he said loudly. "We are working for the homeowner association, and she assaulted us when we tried to do our job." Officer Martinez looked at the guard skeptically. "Do you have paperwork showing you had authority to enter this property?" he asked. The guard reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "We have a contract with the HOA to provide security services," he said. "That gives us the right to inspect properties for violations." Officer Martinez examined the document while 2 more police cars arrived. Sarah watched as additional officers got out and began securing the scene. She felt relieved that there were now multiple witnesses to whatever happened next. After reading the security contract, Officer Martinez shook his head. "This contract does not give you authority to enter private property without the owner's permission," he told the guard. "It only allows you to patrol public areas and report violations you observe from the street." The guard seemed surprised by this information. "But our supervisor told us we had full authority to inspect any property in the neighborhood," he protested. "Your supervisor was wrong," Officer Martinez said firmly. "You were trespassing on this property, and according to the homeowner's account, you attempted to draw weapons on a woman with children after she asked you to leave." Sarah felt vindicated by the officer's assessment. Her understanding of property rights and security law had been correct. The guards had no legal authority to enter her yard or threaten her family. Officer Martinez turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, can you explain how you came to be in possession of their weapons?" he asked. "The guards claim you attacked them." Sarah had expected this question. "I used defensive techniques to protect myself and my children after they attempted to draw weapons on us," she explained. "I have military training that taught me how to disarm threatening individuals without causing serious injury." "Military training?" Officer Martinez asked with interest. "I served 8 years as a Navy SEAL before leaving the military to raise my family," Sarah said. "When someone draws a weapon on me and my children, I respond according to my training." Officer Martinez nodded with understanding. He seemed to have more respect for Sarah now that he knew about her military background. Many police officers had worked with military personnel and understood their training and capabilities. One of the other officers was interviewing the security guards separately. Sarah could hear them giving conflicting accounts of what had happened. The young guard who had surrendered was telling a different story than the lead guard who had tried to grab her phone. Emma came running out of the house as Mike's car pulled into the driveway. She ran straight to Sarah and hugged her leg tightly. "Mommy, are the bad men going away?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said softly. "The police officers are taking care of everything." Mike got out of his car looking worried and confused. He had driven home as fast as he could after Emma called him at work. He surveyed the scene with wide eyes, taking in the police cars, the security guards, and the pile of weapons next to his wife. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked as he approached the group. Officer Martinez answered before Sarah could respond. "Your wife defended herself and your children against 3 armed trespassers," he said with approval in his voice. "She handled the situation professionally and with appropriate restraint." Mike looked at Sarah with amazement. He had always known about her military background, but he had never seen her defensive skills in action. The idea that she had disarmed 3 armed men while protecting their children was almost too much to believe. "Are they going to be arrested?" Mike asked, pointing at the security guards. "We are still investigating," Officer Martinez said. "But based on what I have seen so far, they committed several crimes today. Trespassing, assault, and possibly impersonating police officers by claiming authority they do not have." Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction hearing the officer's assessment. The security guards had escalated a civil dispute into a criminal matter through their own illegal actions. The HOA board had made a serious mistake by hiring these men. Officer Martinez asked Sarah to write a detailed statement about what had happened. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Jake on her lap and Emma next to her, carefully documenting every detail of the encounter. She included the guards' claims of authority, their refusal to leave when asked, and their attempts to draw weapons. While Sarah was writing her statement, she could see more activity outside. Additional police cars had arrived, and she could see officers talking to neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion. Mrs. Patterson was standing on her front porch, looking concerned but supportive. After Sarah finished her statement, Officer Martinez reviewed it carefully. "This is very thorough," he said. "Your military training shows in how you document incidents. This will be helpful if this case goes to court." "Will there be charges filed?" Sarah asked. "That will be up to the district attorney," Officer Martinez said. "But based on the evidence and witness statements, I expect there will be charges against at least 2 of the guards. The third one who surrendered may face lesser charges." Sarah felt relieved that the legal system was taking the situation seriously. She had been worried that the guards' claims of authority might be taken at face value. But the police officers clearly understood that security companies could not just claim whatever powers they wanted. As the police finished their investigation, Sarah noticed Robert Hayes pulling up to the scene in his expensive car. He got out and approached Officer Martinez with an attitude of authority and entitlement. "Officer, I am Robert Hayes, president of the Oakwood Heights HOA, he announced. "These security guards were working under contract for our community association. I need to understand why they are being treated as criminals." Officer Martinez looked at Hayes with the same skeptical expression he had used with the guards. "Mr. Hayes, your security contractors committed multiple crimes on this property today. The fact that you hired them does not give them authority to trespass and threaten residents." Hayes seemed shocked by the officer's response. "But we have the right to enforce community standards," he protested. "These people have been violating HOA rules and refusing to cooperate with our compliance efforts. Civil violations do not give you the right to send armed men onto someone's property," Officer Martinez said firmly. "If you have disputes with residents, you need to resolve them through proper legal channels, not through intimidation and threats." Sarah watched this exchange with great interest. Hayes was revealing that he had specifically directed the security guards to target her family. This could be evidence of a criminal conspiracy to harass residents who challenged the HOA board. Officer Martinez seemed to recognize the significance of Hayes's statements. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a statement about your involvement in today's incident," he said. "And I suggest you contact your lawyer before you do that." Hayes looked worried for the first time since Sarah had known him. He was beginning to realize that his harassment campaign against neighborhood families had crossed legal lines that could result in serious consequences. For him personally, as the police cars finally left Sarah's driveway, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The confrontation with the security guards had been stressful, but it had also exposed the HOA board's illegal tactics in a way that could not be ignored or covered up. The neighborhood dispute had transformed into a criminal investigation that would force everyone to account for their actions. Sarah's military training had protected her family, but more importantly, it had created an opportunity for justice. The battle with the HOA was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the families who had been targeted for harassment. The newspaper story ran on the front page of the local section 3 days later. Jennifer Walsh had written a detailed article titled, "HOA Harassment Campaign Ends in Armed Confrontation." The story included interviews with Sarah and several other targeted families, as well as comments from legal experts about homeowner rights. Sarah read the article over coffee while Emma ate breakfast, and Jake played in his high chair. The story was fair and factual, focusing on the pattern of harassment rather than just the dramatic confrontation. It explained how HOA boards could abuse their power and what residents could do to protect themselves. The article also mentioned that the district attorney was investigating whether criminal charges should be filed, against HOA board members who had directed the harassment campaign. This was news to Sarah, and it made her realize how seriously authorities were taking the situation. Mike read the article on his phone during his commute to work. He called Sarah from the office to tell her that several of his colleagues had already seen the story online. "This is getting a lot of attention," he said. "The comment section is full of people sharing their own HOA horror stories." The phone started ringing soon after the newspaper hit the stands. Sarah received calls from other homeowners in different neighborhoods who had experienced similar harassment. Some wanted advice about fighting their own HOA boards. Others wanted to share their stories and express support for her family. One call particularly interested Sarah. It was from David Chen, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He had read the newspaper article and wanted to offer his services to the Oakwood Heights families. "Your case illustrates several violations of state laws that govern homeowner associations," David explained. "I think you have grounds for a significant lawsuit against the board members personally, not just the HOA as an organization." Sarah arranged to meet with David that afternoon along with the other targeted families. They gathered at the community center, ironically the same building where the HOA held its monthly meetings. David reviewed their documentation and listened to their stories with growing excitement. "This is one of the clearest cases of systematic harassment I have seen," David told the group. "The board members violated their fiduciary duties to the community and used their positions to retaliate against residents who exercise their legal rights." David explained that HOA board members could be held personally liable for actions that violated state laws or the association's governing documents. The harassment campaign, the unauthorized use of security guards, and the retaliation against residents who complained all crossed legal lines that removed the board's normal protections. "How much could this lawsuit be worth?" Mr. Rodriguez asked. "That depends on several factors," David said. "But given the emotional distress, the impact on property values, and the clear evidence of civil rights violations, we could be looking at six-figure damages for each family." Sarah was surprised by the potential size of the lawsuit. She had been focused on stopping the harassment and holding the board accountable. The possibility of significant financial compensation had not occurred to her. David also explained that a successful lawsuit could force major changes in how the HOA operated. "We can seek court orders that require new leadership, better oversight of board decisions and procedures to prevent future harassment," he said. The families agreed to hire David to represent them as a group. They would split the legal costs equally and share any settlement or judgment proportionally based on the damages each family had suffered. That evening, Sarah received an angry phone call from Robert Hayes. His conciliatory tone from earlier in the week was completely gone, replaced by barely controlled rage. "You had no right to talk to that reporter," Hayes yelled into the phone. "That article makes the entire community look bad and could hurt property values for everyone." Sarah remained calm despite Hayes' anger. "The article reported facts about your board's behavior," she said. "If you are concerned about the community's reputation, maybe you should have thought about that before hiring armed guards to harass families with children." Hayes seemed to realize that yelling was not helping his situation. "Look, we can still resolve this privately," he said. "The board is prepared to make a generous settlement offer if you agree to stop talking to the media." Sarah was curious about what Hayes considered generous. "What kind of settlement are you thinking about?" she asked. "We could waive all violation notices, pay for any legal costs you have incurred, and make a modest payment for your inconvenience," Hayes said. "Maybe $10,000 to make this whole situation go away." Sarah almost laughed at the offer. "Mr. Hayes, your security guards committed felonies on my property while threatening my children," she said. $10,000 does not begin to address the seriousness of what your board has done." Hayes sounded desperate. "What would it take to resolve this? We just want to move forward and put this behind us." Sarah had discussed this possibility with the other families and with their new lawyer. "It would take your resignation and the resignation of the entire current board," she said. "It would also require a complete overhaul of how the HOA operates, with independent oversight to prevent future harassment." "That is impossible," Hayes said immediately. "The board members were elected by the community. We cannot just resign because you are unhappy with our decisions." Sarah was not surprised by his refusal. "Then I guess we will see you in court," she said before hanging up. The next day brought more developments. Officer Martinez called to inform Sarah that the district attorney had decided to file criminal charges against Robert Hayes and 2 other board members. They were being charged with conspiracy to commit harassment and abuse of their positions of authority. The investigation found evidence that the board members specifically directed the security company to intimidate families who had complained about board decisions, Officer Martinez explained. That crosses the line from civil disputes into criminal behavior. Sarah felt vindicated by the criminal charges. The legal system was recognizing that the board's actions went far beyond normal HOA enforcement and constituted a pattern of criminal harassment. The news about the criminal charges spread quickly through the neighborhood. Sarah could see neighbors gathering in small groups to discuss the developments. Some seemed supportive of the legal action, while others appeared worried about the negative attention the community was receiving. Mrs. Patterson stopped by that afternoon with more information. 3 board members have already submitted their resignations, she reported. Hayes is refusing to resign, but the other 2 do not want to face criminal charges. This was better news than Sarah had expected. If most of the board resigned, new elections could be held to choose more reasonable leadership. The community might be able to resolve its problems without a lengthy legal battle, but Sarah was not ready to declare victory yet. Hayes was still fighting, and he might try other tactics to maintain his control over the community. The criminal charges would take months to resolve, and Hayes could cause more problems while those cases were pending. Sarah called David Chen to update him on the latest developments. The resignations are good news, David said. But we should continue with the civil lawsuit to make sure there are financial consequences for their behavior. Otherwise, they might think they can get away with harassment as long as they resign before facing serious consequences. Sarah agreed with David's assessment. The lawsuit would ensure that Hayes and his allies paid a real price for their abuse of power. It would also create a legal precedent that might discourage similar harassment in other communities. That evening, Sarah attended an emergency HOA meeting that had been called to address the board resignations. The community center was packed with residents who wanted to understand what was happening to their neighborhood association. Hayes presided over the meeting, but he looked tired and defeated. He announced the resignations of the other board members and called for volunteers to serve temporarily until new elections could be held. Several residents stepped forward, including Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Chen from Sarah's support group. During the public comment period, Sarah stood up to address the community. She explained how the harassment had started with minor violation letters and escalated to armed guards threatening her family. She emphasized that the board's behavior had violated both the law and the trust that residents placed in elected representatives. This is not about fence heights or landscaping rules, Sarah said. This is about whether board members can use their positions to retaliate against residents who ask questions or express different opinions. No community can function properly when leaders abuse their power to intimidate their neighbors. Several other residents spoke in support of Sarah and the other targeted families, but a few neighbors criticized her for bringing negative attention to the community through media coverage and legal action. You could have resolved this privately instead of making it a public scandal, one neighbor said. Now our property values might suffer because of all this bad publicity. Sarah understood the concern about property values, but she also knew that tolerating harassment would create worse problems in the long run. The news of the confrontation spread through Oakwood Heights within hours. Sarah's phone started ringing that evening as neighbors called to ask about what had happened. Some were supportive, but others seemed worried about how the incident might affect property values or the community's reputation. Mrs. Patterson came over after dinner with a casserole and genuine concern. I saw everything from my front porch, she told Sarah as they sat in the living room. Those guards were way out of line. I am so proud of how you handled yourself. Sarah appreciated the support, but she was also worried about retaliation. The HOA board is not going to give up just because their security guards got arrested, she said. They might try something else to get back at us. Emma was playing quietly with her dolls nearby, but Sarah could tell she was listening to the adult conversation. The incident had frightened her daughter, and Sarah wanted to make sure Emma felt safe in their own home again. Mike was still processing everything that had happened. I cannot believe you disarmed 3 armed men while holding Jake, he said for the 3rd time that evening. I mean, I knew you had military training, but seeing it in action was incredible. Sarah did not want to make too big a deal about her defensive skills. "Any parent would protect their children," she said simply. "I just had better training than most people for dealing with that kind of situation." The next morning brought more developments. Officer Martinez called to inform Sarah that the district attorney had decided to file charges against all 3 security guards. The lead guard faced the most serious charges, including assault, trespassing, and impersonating a police officer. "We also want to investigate the security company that hired these men," Officer Martinez explained. "It appears they were telling their employees they had authority that they did not actually have. That could be criminal fraud." Sarah was pleased that the investigation was expanding beyond just the individual guards. The security company and possibly the HOA board needed to be held accountable for creating the situation that led to the confrontation. Later that morning, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed woman in her 40s knocked on the front door and introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh, a reporter for the local newspaper. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Jennifer said. "I am working on a story about HOA disputes in the area, and I think your situation illustrates some important issues that residents should know about." Sarah was hesitant to talk to a reporter. She did not want media attention to make the situation worse for her family, but she also recognized that publicity might help other families who are facing similar harassment from abusive HOA boards. "Can we talk off the record first?" Sarah asked. "I want to understand how this story might be presented before I decide whether to participate." Jennifer agreed, and they sat in Sarah's living room while Emma played in the backyard. Sarah explained the history of the dispute, from the fence violation letters to the escalating harassment campaign to yesterday's confrontation with armed guards. Jennifer took notes and asked thoughtful questions. She seemed genuinely interested in the broader issue of HOA abuse, rather than just the dramatic details of the confrontation. "This fits a pattern I have been investigating," she said. "Several communities in the area have had problems with HOA boards that use intimidation tactics against residents." Sarah decided to cooperate with the story. "If this helps other families understand their rights and avoid what we went through, then I think it is worth talking publicly," she said. Jennifer interviewed Sarah for over an hour, getting details about the HOA's harassment tactics and the legal issues involved. She also asked about Sarah's military background and how her training had helped her handle the confrontation. "A lot of people would have been terrified in that situation," Jennifer observed. "Your military experience probably saved your family from a much worse outcome." Sarah agreed, but she also wanted to emphasize that any homeowner could learn their rights and stand up to abusive HOA boards. "You do not need military training to document harassment and file complaints with the appropriate authorities," she said. "The key is knowing your rights and not being intimidated by people who claim authority they do not actually have." That afternoon, Sarah received a call from Robert Hayes. His tone was very different from his usual arrogant attitude. He sounded worried and conciliatory. "Mrs. Miller, I want to discuss a resolution to our ongoing dispute," Hayes said carefully. "Perhaps we can find a way to move forward that works for everyone." Sarah was immediately suspicious. "What kind of resolution are you thinking about?" she asked. "Well, the board has decided that your fence is actually within acceptable limits," Hayes said quickly. "We are prepared to withdraw all violation notices and end any legal proceedings related to the fence height issue." Sarah almost laughed at the sudden change in the board's position. "Yesterday you were sending armed guards to my house over 2 inches of fence height," she said. "Now suddenly the fence is acceptable. What changed your mind?" Hayes seemed uncomfortable with the question. "The board has reviewed the original building permits more carefully," he said. "We realized there may have been some confusion about the approval process." Sarah knew exactly what had changed Hayes' mind. The criminal charges against his security guards and the police investigation into the HOA's harassment tactics had made him realize how much legal trouble he was facing. "Mr. Hayes, the fence was always legally approved," Sarah said firmly. "The board's harassment campaign was never about rule enforcement. It was about intimidating families who question your authority." Hayes tried to sound reasonable. "Perhaps there have been misunderstandings on both sides," he said. "The important thing now is to restore harmony in our community." Sarah was not interested in letting Hayes off the hook so easily. "The misunderstanding was your board's belief that you could harass and intimidate residents without consequences," she said. Yesterday's incident proved that assumption was wrong. After hanging up with Hayes, Sarah called the other families who had been targeted by the HOA. She wanted to make sure they knew about Hayes' sudden change in attitude and his attempt to resolve disputes. Quickly, Mrs. Chen was not surprised by the news. "He is trying to limit his legal exposure," she said. "If this becomes a pattern of harassment rather than isolated incidents, he could face much more serious consequences." Mr. Rodriguez agreed. "We should not let him resolve our cases individually," he said. "If we stick together, we can expose the full extent of their harassment campaign and make sure this does not happen to other families." The group decided to meet that evening to discuss strategy. They wanted to coordinate their response to Hayes' offers and make sure the investigation revealed the full scope of the board's illegal activities. When the families gathered at Sarah's house again, they had a different attitude than in their previous meetings. They were no longer scared victims trying to protect themselves. They were now organized residents with evidence of criminal wrongdoing who could demand real accountability. Sarah showed them copies of all the violation letters she had received and the documentation she had gathered about the board's harassment tactics. Combined with the other families' experiences, they had a clear pattern of retaliation against residents who challenged the board's authority. "We need to make sure the police and the district attorney understand that yesterday's incident was not isolated," Sarah said. "It was the culmination of a systematic harassment campaign that targeted multiple families." Mrs. Williams had brought something that surprised everyone. She had recorded several of her phone conversations with HOA board members, including one where Hayes explicitly threatened to make her life miserable if she continued complaining about their landscaping contractor. "I started recording calls after they threatened me the first time," she explained. "I thought I might need evidence if things got worse." The recording was damaging evidence against Hayes. It proved that he had personally directed harassment against residents who questioned board decisions. Combined with his statements to the police about authorizing the security guard's actions, it painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. The group spent the evening organizing all their evidence and planning their next steps. They would share everything with the police investigation and work with Jennifer Walsh on her newspaper story. They would also research the process for removing board members and electing new leadership for the HOA. Most importantly, they would not accept individual settlements that allowed Hayes and the other board members to avoid accountability for their actions. They wanted systemic change that would protect all residents from future harassment. As the meeting ended, Sarah felt confident that they had turned the situation around completely. What had started as intimidation of individual families had become an organized resistance movement with legal support and media attention. The HOA board's escalation to armed guards had been their biggest mistake. It had transformed a civil dispute into a criminal investigation that could not be easily covered up or dismissed. Hayes and his allies were about to learn that bullying tactics work only against isolated victims. When faced with organized resistance and legal consequences, bullies usually discovered they were not as powerful as they thought. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her backyard watching Emma and Jake play on the swing set. The fence that had started all the trouble was still exactly 6 feet and 2 inches tall, and no one had complained about it in months. The spring flowers were blooming and the neighborhood felt peaceful again. The legal resolution had come faster than anyone expected. Robert Hayes had finally agreed to resign from the HOA board after his lawyer explained how much the criminal charges and civil lawsuit were likely to cost him. The other board members who had participated in the harassment campaign had already stepped down to avoid further legal problems. David Chen had negotiated a settlement with the former board members that exceeded everyone's expectations. Each of the targeted families received $45,000 in damages, plus payment of all their legal costs. Hayes and his allies had been forced to pay from their personal assets after the HOA's insurance company refused to cover intentional harassment and criminal activities. The criminal cases had also been resolved through plea agreements. Hayes received 2 years of probation and had to perform community service. The security guards who had threatened Sarah's family had been convicted of assault and trespassing charges. The security company had lost its license and was forced to shut down after investigators found they had been misleading their employees about their legal authority. But the most important changes were in how the Oakwood Heights HOA operated. New board members had been elected who were committed to transparency and fair enforcement of community rules. They had implemented new policies that required proper procedures before taking any enforcement actions against residents. Mrs. Patterson had been elected as the new board president. She had established regular office hours when residents could meet with board members to discuss concerns. She had also created committees to review the HOA's contracts and spending to ensure community funds were used properly. The old board thought they were rulers instead of representatives. Mrs. Patterson told Sarah during one of their regular coffee conversations, "We are trying to remember that we work for the residents, not the other way around." The new board had also established procedures to prevent future harassment. Any enforcement actions had to be approved by majority vote after residents were given opportunities to explain their situations. Board members could not retaliate against residents who complained or asked questions at meetings. Sarah's fence had become something of a symbol in the neighborhood. New residents were often told the story of how a 2-inch height difference had led to criminal charges and major reforms. The fence reminded everyone that small disputes could escalate quickly if they were not handled fairly and reasonably. Mike had been promoted at work, partly because of the recognition he received for supporting his family during the difficult situation. His colleagues respected how he and Sarah had stood up to intimidation and fought for their rights through proper legal channels. Emma had recovered well from the traumatic encounter with the security guards. She sometimes asked questions about why some adults tried to be mean to their family, and Sarah used these conversations to teach her about standing up to bullies and protecting people who could not protect themselves. Jake was too young to remember the confrontation, but he would grow up in a neighborhood where residents' rights were respected and protected. Sarah hoped he would never have to deal with the kind of harassment her family had faced. The newspaper story had inspired similar investigations in other communities. Jennifer Walsh had won a journalism award for her coverage of HOA abuse, and her follow-up articles had led to reforms in how homeowner associations were regulated at the state level. Sarah had testified before a legislative committee about the need for better oversight of HOA boards. New laws had been passed that required training for board members and created easier processes for residents to file complaints about harassment and abuse of power. Your case changed things for thousands of families across the state. David Chen told Sarah when they met for coffee to celebrate the first anniversary of the settlement. Board members now know they can face real consequences if they abuse their positions. Sarah was proud of what her family and neighbors had accomplished. But she had not sought to become a public figure or activist. She was content to return to her quiet life as a mother and community member. However, she occasionally spoke to groups of homeowners who were facing similar harassment campaigns. The key is documentation and organization, Sarah would tell these groups. Keep records of everything, know your legal rights, and do not try to fight alone. Bullies rely on isolation and fear, but they cannot handle organized resistance with legal support. Sarah's military training had been crucial in the physical confrontation with the security guards, but her victory over the HOA board had come through legal and community organizing strategies that any resident could learn and use. The Oakwood Heights community had become stronger and more united through the experience of fighting harassment together. Neighbors who had never spoken before became friends. Families who had been afraid to speak up at board meetings now participated actively in community decisions. Property values in the neighborhood had actually increased after the reforms were implemented. Potential buyers were attracted to a community with transparent governance and protections against harassment. The negative publicity from the harassment scandal had been replaced by positive recognition for the community's reforms. Sarah often reflected on how different things might have been if she had simply agreed to cut 2 inches off her fence when the first violation letter arrived. Her family would have avoided months of stress and confrontation, but the underlying problems with the HOA board would have continued. Other families would have been targeted for harassment. The board's abuse of power would have continued and probably gotten worse over time. By standing up to bullying tactics, Sarah had helped protect not just her own family, but all the families who might have been targeted in the future. The fence still stood at 6 feet and 2 inches, a daily reminder that sometimes small principles are worth fighting for, not because fence height was inherently important, but because the right to be treated fairly and respectfully by community leaders was essential to any functioning democracy. Emma was now old, enough to understand more of what had happened during that difficult period. Sarah had explained to her daughter how important it was to stand up for what was right, even when it was scary or difficult. "Will bad people try to hurt our family again?" Emma had asked one evening while Sarah was tucking her into bed. "There might be bad people who try to hurt others," Sarah had replied. "But we know how to protect ourselves, and we have good neighbors and friends who will help us. Most importantly, we know right from wrong, and we are not afraid to do what is right." Sarah looked at her fence one more time before calling the children inside for dinner. It was exactly 6 feet and 2 inches tall, perfectly legal and completely unremarkable. But it represented something much more important than property boundaries. It represented the principle that families should be able to live peacefully in their homes without fear of harassment from people who abuse small amounts of power. It represented the idea that ordinary residents could successfully fight back against bullying and intimidation through legal and democratic processes. Most importantly, it represented the truth that military training, legal knowledge, and community organizing were all forms of preparation for protecting the things that mattered most: family, home, and the right to be treated with dignity and respect. The fence would remain at 6 feet and 2 inches for as long as the Miller family lived in Oakwood Heights. And every time Sarah looked at it, she would remember that sometimes the smallest stands can make the biggest difference.